Hi class, and welcome back to another lecture for Psych 242. Today we're going to be talking about Chapter 14, going over the relevant research to this behavioral/social learning approach. A couple quick announcements before we begin. Remember, other than the office hours, which hopefully by now I've drilled into your brain, you need to get those 3 SONA credits done by the end of this semester. We are wrapping things up in terms of SONA, so please do get that done ASAP if you haven't already. What are we going to be talking about today? Well, today we're going to talk about a couple different topics. We're going to start off by talking about gender roles. Afterwards, we're going to talk about observational learning of aggression, spending a good amount of time on learned helplessness, and then talking about locus of control. A lot of what I'm going to be presenting today, I think, deserves some good amount of time of discussion in the classroom. So hoping everybody comes prepared to discuss about some of these topics, as I think that they're really interesting given what we know about behaviorism and social learning. But with that in mind, let's start off by talking about gender roles. And gender roles are very interesting because we can see them in many different cultures all across the world. And when we think about the reasons for this, well, it's clear one of this reason is the fact that this is a biological difference between the sexes, right? I physically, as a man, am unable to give birth, and as a woman, there are certain things that a man can't do. But this is also the result of a lifelong process of gender role socialization. Throughout our lives, we are very socialized by what other people do. And we often acquire these things through observational learning, knowing how to act like a young boy might learn how to act like a man from their dad. For instance, girls often play dress up, where they put on their mom's clothes or jewelry and makeup. And usually this is after identifying that this is something for females to do, but not males to do. We don't necessarily expect young boys who know the difference between what a girl wears and a boy wears to typically imitate this behavior. Again, suggesting that the only difference there is what has been taught. We also talk about this idea of individual differences and this kind of dimension of masculinity to femininity, right? Traditionally, this was, you are X amount masculine, you're X amount feminine, but we've changed the wording to use some less emotionally loaded labels, as they say. So agency is more of a masculine trait by this definition, where it is independent, assertiveness, and control are all relevant to this idea of masculinity or agency. So independence, a good way to describe agency is ability to do something. And then there's this idea of communion, attachment, cooperation, and interpersonal connection, which is similar to femininity, this idea being a little bit closer to what we consider more of the traditional feminine roles. But again, as I'm going to keep bringing up, this is all a socialized phenomenon for the most part. So while we do have this scale, we understand it is not exactly the only way to look at this. And let's talk about another way that we can actually describe these individual differences between masculinity and femininity. So this other way is called the androgyny model. And oftentimes, we know the word androgynous, means kind of unsure about what gender or what masculinity, femininity kind of level. I pull up a picture of David Bowie here, somebody who was very frequently dressed as in some pretty androgynous and outrageous outfits. And this is the idea that masculinity and femininity are 2 independent traits. You can be high in masculinity and high in femininity, or low on both, or whatever you want to do. This maintains that, the most well-adjusted person has some masculine and some feminine traits. They're probably not extremely high in both, but they probably have some of both. And this really comes from this challenged assumption that, a person's gender should match his or her gender type. So androgynously, we're talking about maintaining that this idea of a well-adjusted person having both masculine and feminine traits. Now, this makes a lot of sense, in the sense of when we talk about agency versus communion, as we did on the last slide. It's good to be independent, but if you're totally independent, you're so high on this agency or masculinity scale, you're doing nothing more than probably pushing other people away, and really not exactly being a well-rounded person is maybe a good way to put that. And it's understandable to have both masculine and feminine traits as kind of a more well-rounded person. But not only this, when we look at gender type and well-being, we'll look at 3 different models here. So the congruence model states that masculine men and feminine women tend to be the most well-adjusted. This is your classic, what you would have heard all the way through most of our history as a society, that men are supposed to be masculine and women are supposed to be feminine. I think about that book, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, right? And that each gender has its specific things that make them well adjusted to their gender. We can argue about that, and I think there's a fair amount of criticism for that point. There's this masculinity model as well, right? Maintaining that being masculine for both genders is important to mental health. And if we think about that not as masculine, but as agent, like having agency, that is going to be make a little bit more sense. But I don't necessarily, personally, I have some critiques about the masculinity model as well, that probably, right, having some masculine traits is good for health, but not just masculinity. So maybe this androgyny model, right, where our repertoires, right, actually lack either masculine or feminine behaviors, tend to be more difficult, have more struggles. So having like neither of these might cause a problem. So this is very complex. Again, right? We are still learning and understanding what gender means and how it's so tied to things like culture. But we do know that it seems that people who have relatively high levels of femininity and masculinity, regardless of gender, tend to be more socially well-adjusted and likely have better well-being. But some of the interesting research, and this was something that I was really surprised about, was that, in terms of interpersonal relationships, people like more feminine or more androgynous people. And this is not necessarily in terms of appearance, obviously, right? But maybe, and what I thought of this is, part of this is that masculinity can have some toxic components to it, right? Like not sharing your emotions, right? Being hard when you don't have to, right? Maybe using violence unnecessarily. And these go back into the reasons that we talk about gender mattering, or gender type mattering for interpersonal relationships, right? Feminine individuals tend to score highly on being sensitive to others' needs. Now, that's a really useful trait to have, to be emotionally understanding of others. Androgynous people tend to be more aware and better able to express romantic feelings. Being able to express feelings is something that, again, is not necessarily seen as a masculine trait. So being able to express feelings, period, let alone like romantic feelings, is going to be very valuable. And it seems to be the case where feminine and androgynous individuals tend to communicate better than purely quote unquote masculine individuals. So this all suggests that, right, at least in relationships, right, maybe it's good to have a little bit of a soft side, or be a little, or have some of these feminine traits. But we know, even given that, there is an extreme social pressure to act masculine or feminine, that we have these strong pressures to act like a man or a lady, and this hasn't disappeared. And when we talk about the societal pressure, right, and how we have to conform to what society tells us to do, otherwise we feel right, left out or outcasts, right, forcing us into these boxes tends to do a lot more harm than good. And maybe we should, right, break these chains of gender roles. Now, one thing to mention, and I like how the book talks about this, is this idea of unmitigated agency and unmitigated communion. So unmitigated meaning just like completely and totally just this. So just agentic, or just like communion focused, I guess would be the word. So talking about this being purely agentic, this tends to be more of like a narcissistic personality. People tend to focus on them and exclude others, or don't really care about what others do. And then when it comes to situations in which people rely on others, they're much more likely to turn potential friends away, maybe again thinking, right, trying to be tough, trying to act like the stoic individual when they could use help. Now, on the other hand, right, so first off, we shouldn't be super high in unmitigated agency, right? Again, it's probably not good to only care about ourselves. It's going to be at the detriment of our social groups. But on the other hand, it's probably also pretty bad to be on the other level or on the other side of this in too high an unmitigated communion, right? Being able to give your shirt off your back is good in some things, but you don't want to do this to literally everyone. What we see is that people who are very concerned with taking care of the needs of others, they tend to sacrifice their own needs and interests in order to either placate other individuals, in order to help other individuals. And what you see is that this usually includes people who score low on measures of well-being and self-esteem, maybe trying to be part of a group, trying to see this communion with one another. And this is also not only related to lower scores of self-esteem, but higher scores of depression. So while these individuals are wonderful people, being able to help other people and give the shirt off their back, so to speak, they might also be losing something through doing this, right? Maybe almost, right? I kind of think of this like being walked over like a doormat at the extreme. So moving on from there to observational learning of aggression, we've spent some time talking about this already, given what we know about Bobo and Bandura's stuff regarding that. So let's just talk about Bandura's 4-step model. So the 4 steps before exposure to aggression leads an individual to act aggressively. So here is a good example of just generally in social learning, these 4. Right, this is the visual representation of this for social learning, but specific to aggression, right, this works more or less the same. The first one is that we have to see an aggressive action, right? So if we see an aggressive action, we pay attention to it, that is our first kind of step to learn this behavior. The second is remembering that information. So being able to retain it and be able to understand maybe a little bit about what happened and really, possibly thinking about it as to why it did happen. The third step is being able to reproduce this or enacting it when it's seen. So if we're able to, right, we see somebody hit somebody else, right, my daughter can just flail her arms around right now. She can't really hit anybody on purpose, right? She wouldn't be able to reproduce that, but a younger, 2 or 3-year-old kid might see somebody hit somebody else on the playground and they might be able to enact that as well. And what's the most important is this idea of motivation. So are we motivated to imitate this behavior? Did we see something good happen when this behavior happened, right? Otherwise, we might not do it. So if, we see somebody hit somebody else and everybody gets in trouble, we're not going to expect a reward for that to happen to us, but it's possible that something like that might be there. Now, talking about this model, I think is a really useful way to think about how we can model aggressive behaviors. The book spends some time talking about mass media, aggression, video games, and stuff like that. And while I do have some slides on that, I think it's better served having this discussion during class rather than before it. So we'll talk about this idea of video games and aggression in a lot more depth in class. So let's move on to another topic that I think is something that you can use in your own life to really understand why things seem more difficult than they are sometimes. And I know I'm definitely somebody who has fallen into this trap of learned helplessness. And learned helplessness originally started and it came out of basic conditioning research, right? And it started with animals, with lab animals. And what happened was, more or less, what you do is you train a dog or an animal. In this case, it was a dog. And what you have them do is you train a bell to be paired with an electric shock. And the animals quickly learn that when they can't do anything to get away from the shock, they just accept it. So they hear the bell, they know the shock is coming, and they kind of just, oh no, and they let it happen. And so whenever a signal sounded, right, this bell, what they did was they put them in this, or I should say, they put this in them in this box afterwards, where they had the shock of this this kind of shock grating down here. And what they did was when they heard the bell sound, if the dog were to jump over to this side, they would not be shocked. They only get shocked on this side. But because the dogs have been conditioned to know that the shock is coming and there's nothing you can do about it, guess what? Those dogs actually didn't bother to jump over and save themselves from the shock. They have learned to be helpless. They think there is nothing they can do. And that's incredibly difficult to hear about, and personally, because we know these dogs could have done that. How terrible it is to sit there and think those dogs went, well, I'm just stuck doing this, because that's not the truth. And not only that, we see this in humans. I know this is a picture of a dog, but I really like the quote they said, and it's a dog, so we'll put it on the screen. Learned helplessness is when past situations make you give up in the present. Well, I can't do anything. Why even bother trying? So people who learn this idea of helplessness in an uncontrollable setting typically are unable to break out of it. They're unable to get beyond that idea of failure. They almost see it as it's unable to be overcome. Right? And sometimes people learn to be helpless by just simply observing other people who are helpless. So imagine I think a good example of this is when you go to a classroom and the door is locked or everybody's standing outside. Typically, you don't go walk up and open the door to check it because you assume somebody else did. I don't say this is necessarily an example of learned helplessness in a very broad setting, but right, you've watched kind of other people do these things, and right, maybe you've seen somebody else go jiggle the door handle, but you're just not going to do it. And in that setting, it makes sense. But in other settings, like I failed one exam, shouldn't I be able to do better on a different exam? What we see is that especially regarding some of this stuff, elderly people seem to struggle a lot with this. We know that individuals in nursing homes, or as they call them here, old age homes, they often are getting things taken care from them. And because they're getting things taken care from them, they actually feel less in control, and they are maybe more likely to give up and not try. So say, right, if you are getting food every day and you no longer have to cook, and one day the food doesn't come, you might just sit there and go, oh, there's nothing I can do. Well, you could cook before, can you not cook now? Right? You may generalize the perception of uncontrollability to other areas of your life. This isn't just in one specific place. The lack of motivation activity in elderly people could be a form of highly generalized learned helplessness. It could be, but right, more research needs to be done on this. There's a great article I was reading, came out a couple years ago about learned helplessness in academia. And what you see is that students who put in the effort tend to really do well, but some students fall into this learned helplessness. I'm dumb and I'll never learn from this. And that's not necessarily the case. We can overcome learned helplessness a lot of the times. It is, and part of the problem with learned helplessness is that it seems to be related to some psychological disorders, right? We know that observations have led psychologists suggest that depression seems to develop similarly to learned helplessness. And we know the neurotransmitter serotonin, our happy chemical in the brain, helps the development of learned helplessness and depression. It's typically a lower amount of serotonin. The more serotonin you have, the less likely you are to be depressed, the less likely you are to fall into this learned helplessness. However, that's not the only piece of this puzzle. It's not a purely biological one. And we know that learned helplessness acts as an important model for understanding depression because they seem to work very similarly. This gives us a lot of good insight into future research on depression. And again, what I find most interesting is this is coming out of a chapter based on behaviorism. And now we're talking about depression, which is a purely psychological mechanism that has sometimes physical manifestations. But that is going on up here where the true level of behaviorism, the true kind of original behaviorism was purely behavior and no mental thoughts at all. But that's an aside. Talking about our last topic here, let's go on to locus of control. And so we spent some time last week talking a bit about what locus of control is, right? An internal locus of control believes, or somebody with an internal locus of control, right, thinks that they affect what happens to them. They are the kind of master of their own environment. They are the agent of change, right? My good or bad experiences come from what I do. That's for the internal locus of control. Now, on the other end, we've got this external locus of control, where the control is coming from outside of you, right? People who believe what happens to them and others is outside of their control. You are simply left up to the fates. Well, we know, right, that this is not the only way of thinking things. Another good picture between internal and external here. But people who suffer from psychological disorders tend to have more of an external than an internal attribution or locus of control. And part of this reason, unsurprisingly, comes from learned helplessness. So again, maybe seeing how some of these things are correlated pretty heavily or kind of coming up again and again along with other things. So learned helplessness and depression seem to be very well linked. Now, regarding locus of control, we see some really clear instances regarding things like grades and being able to achieve certain things. So we know that internal students, so students with an internal locus of control, this belief that they have the ability, they have the control to do this, they tend to receive higher grades, and those teachers actually who have an internal locus of control have better teaching evaluations than external locus of control. There's also this issue where individuals with external locus of control might blame others for their problems, might blame the teacher for the fact that they're not learning more than somebody with an internal locus of control. But it's not just this idea of grades, right? I mean, this is a big part of it, but right there, we see this in a lot of other aspects in life. And so using school as an example, right, we see students being responsible for their achievements, which is something that's not just in school, but in life, in your job, right? They tend to attribute high test scores to their abilities or studying hard. And so rather than getting lucky, they're good at adjusting their expectancies following feedback, right? So you can imagine somebody who is high in a internal locus of control says, I didn't do so well, but I have the ability to change. So I follow this feedback and I'll make adjustments to do better next time. We've got this idea that individuals in high internal locus of control pay attention to this information that will help them reach their goals. They are actively trying to find ways to do well because, right, this is all coming from the mindset of what can I do to get here and do this. And lastly, we just know that more ambition tends to be a strong thing with high internal locus of control compared to external students. So one thing to note about this is this to me also goes along with this idea of internal motivation, right? So maybe, or like intrinsic motivation would be a better word for it. This idea that typically you are more interested in certain things in your life, and with those things, you tend to focus on the things in which you have a lot of control on. So having a high locus of control, the belief that you're able to do this, and a high intrinsic motivation, this belief that you want to do it, not for external reasons, this is going to be really powerful in helping individuals to achieve in school, in life, in whatever. But we know in terms of psychotherapy, people often struggle with this idea of having maybe too external locus of control. And what we see is that throughout the process, of psychotherapy, individuals tend to become more internal in their locus of control. Now, this is through successful therapy. Simply sitting there for an hour once a week is not going to make you, but actively trying, this will help. What we do know is that the response of clients when therapists focus on giving clients more control over therapy regarding that. So my wording is a little confusing there. How do clients respond? Well, we know that clients with this more external focus sometimes do better when treatment remains in the therapist's hands. Well, I don't know what I'm supposed to do because I think other people have all the control. So can you help me? That's what an external locus of control person might say, where the internal locus of control person might do better when it's like, what can we do to get you to do what you need to? Right? How can we help you to get here? How can you do things outside of this office to help yourself? And notice that those are two very different approaches in understanding that they do matter and they do have very valuable differences. Here's another example of internal and external locus of control. If you're still having trouble, I guess. I just found like 5 good images, threw them on as many slides as I can. But when it comes to health, we know that people with internal LOCs tend to have better health than those who are external in their LOC. If you think about it, this makes a lot of sense. If I don't think I have control over this, there's not much I can do to change this. I'm learning my helplessness, right? Versus an internal locus of control, right? I have the ability to make this change and to allow this to, not rule my life, to allow myself to get in control of my health, whatever it might be. And this is actually really important for things like dieting as well. So this must be a new record because I managed to smash this video down to under half an hour pretty handedly. If you do have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing you in class. Hope to have a good discussion. Don't forget your SONA credits. And if you need anything, always feel free to shoot me an email. Have a great weekend whenever you're watching this. And if you need anything, you know my email. Have a good one.